common topic of late, the power and intelligence of water as above, so below, the unifying substance. Everybody see the screen change okay? And for those of you who don't have screens, I'll try and be as descriptive as possible as to what's going on. And I'm pretty much going to read verbatim off the slides. I'll add some anecdotes here and there, and then hopefully we can field some questions or use the mic or answer some chat box questions that way. So, essential for any new discovery or frontier, and maybe it doesn't seem like it to most of us, and maybe for some of us it is very new. I mean, for me it's still new, and I've been researching water as my primary passion since 2007. Puts it at about 12 years. And it comes in spurts. And you get so far with it, and you can explain so much. And every time you get to a step where you can explain something, demonstrate something, bring it to practicality, you also have another 30 questions in your back pocket. So it's a beautiful thing to study. It's kind of phase in, phase out. And right now is one of those phases where research is going to get heavy again to get this ready to keep up with where it is, because largely the science, which is, a system that's created in order to share and propagate technology safely, it's getting on that doorstep. I still think globally, it's probably 3 to 5 years away from science in the hardcore. But by the time we get there, that it's propagating, it's because leaders have already set the pace 5, 10 years ahead. Just like when Clayton started 10 years ago, this was 10 years ahead of its time. We're just coming to that starting point where it's almost like restarting everything. Everything has to be that much more thorough and better and more professional, and because it has to interact with a world that's highly uh, judgmental, one, for good or for bad, and then for good, critiquing. Because right now there's a lot of technologies coming out, and pretty much everybody's making claims based on a free-for-all, and the struggle with that isn't really worth it. And they're also going to be checked by people like uh, myself and our company's staff on the quantifiable performance of things in a number of ways. And there's more than one way to quantifiably check to see what's going on with structured water. And we're getting into a really physical side of it now, where in the last 10 years we were very focused on the energetic side of things, which is no less or more important than the physical side. They are bound and stuck together like dielectricity and magnetism, for those of you who are around for the presentation on that. And all that stuff was leading up to what goes on underneath from the ether, which is going to come back into play if mankind wants to advance itself, and all these complicated, ever never ending complicated theories such as string theory and quantum mechanics, and all these things are going to start to fall down rapidly. Not that they don't have some useful derivatives, but they are not very good unified modeling at all. And unified modeling is what everybody foundationally should use if you need a leap in development in any industry or commercialism or anything that's going to go down that road. And that's where this is heading. Um, a history of successful use. These are the things you got to check off to run on a large level and complete the original mission statement of the company, which was to share the goodness of this technology with as many people as possible, which means volume up, price down, and a lot more professional, heavier marketing scheme is what it means for every company if it's going to broaden. Where we survive that as a company and a brand, I don't know. I'm just doing the best I can to um, get strapped in and buckled up and get all the checklists ready before takeoff. But who knows when the when the green flag drops, what happens? There's a history of successful use without a shadow of a doubt, and that's why structured water is still around. And the reasoning behind it, which further drives the research to develop and check and balance each other's work, make sure nobody's cheating in their horsepower claims when you go to spend a lot of money on something, or cutting corners, and being aware of what's all involved in structured water from an objective measurable point and a subjective standpoint, and being aware of the difference between interaction with water and its capability to interact with the environment and what the water actually is. They're two different things. You can't sell belief to people. You have to sell them tangible technologies that work and let them know that belief may have an interaction with that, perhaps on a larger level, for these reasons. Unified foundational science from influencers. When I say unified foundational science, I just mean we're all on the same page. We're getting to that point. There's not just me taking this perspective, and the company surely will take to this perspective in its growth and following and development of the technology to better serve the layers of however this product moves through the marketplace. Practical scientific backing from qualified influencers. That's going to be like Manchester University, other laboratories. Um, we do have a bit of that. We've been working on that in the background. And ultimately, brand trust. That's what sells a product. Uh, and the more affiliations you have with the brand product from partners and collaborations and cooperation from other scientists and entities, the easier and easier it gets for you guys. And ultimately, all of you are part of a dealership network or affiliate, and it's your job to spread the news and spread it accurately. So we're taking some time today to make sure this gets out correctly, and we draw the line between what's a good foundation and what's not. And our past science is really shallow and really old, and it's fairly correct, but it's overcomplicated, and at the same time, it's very limited and overcomplicated, which is kind of a double whammy for where we're at with the intelligence of human beings right now. It just doesn't fit what we'd be capable of doing. And so we have a little bit of a mess to clean up in the bigger picture with ourselves and with the planet and how we interact. And just to reiterate the beauty of what water's capable of, and another industry that I was involved and around for quite a while, that the same thing was going on there that was going on in the structured water world, is nobody was really interested in how it works and how to further develop it. They were just interested in metadata, saying whatever you have to say to sell it, making things up without any check, fighting with each other all the time, and going nowhere. And that's been the history of structured water to this day, and it still is there. But you can tell from who's getting involved: Verity Corporation, big corporate conglomerates, some business discussions we're in. Often in recent times, there's a changing dynamic that we have to change with. So, uh, having an understanding that water is capable of these types of things with a totally different scientific behavior, and how implosion behaves versus explosion was a topic we covered greatly in the previous webinars. And so what I'm saying is this whole thing is going to light up in the next couple of years, and we won't be around if we don't operate to our best ability and really tune up on what is, and what we don't know yet is worth looking into and discovering, but by no means has been confirmed by anyone. So we need to clarify between speculation, correlation, precision, accuracy, and what is a fact. And fact's a rough one, but we could stick with a high degree of probability. Um, you see things with implosion mechanics, like it doesn't emit any heat, but when you put it in touch with something, It's as hot as the sun instantaneously. It's a great example of the diversity of this technology and how you really can't pinpoint it, especially water, let alone general unified modeling and uh, subquantum mechanics, ether, whatever you want to talk. It is beyond our perception, and we're allowing that we don't really have any limits, so we can begin to understand how the ether works a little bit better and manifests into solids, into the physical world, which you can't separate from energy. We can speculate that energy exists on its own, but we know nothing of it. Originally, we thought that structured water was a precursor to energetics that supported life. So we believe we're right on that. That one's kind of hard to prove, but you can make very strong correlations with high degrees of probability, such as Andreas Schultz's work with the crystal analysis, because repeatedly the difference between flow form treated water and non is right angles and radial angles. Not necessarily six sided or not necessarily hydrogen bond angle changes, not necessarily these things. And when we look into UV spectroscopy and even NMR, there's really no valid proof that hydrogen bond angles are changing. You can make, and that's some pretty official science that tries to make those claims. They've never seen it, and they've measured it very indirectly, and they've made some intelligent correlations with a lot of mathematics and electronics. There's a lot of room for error in that, but as long as the error is covered within a degree of a certain margin, you can make certain postulations. The reason why I'm against it is because water is a dynamic state, and saying that the hydrogen bond angle changes is assuming the whole water changed to one specific bond angle, because now you got to refer to a measurement. And I see that as completely incorrect. Water in itself is a diversity of creation. And, with 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd molecules per gram, a glass of water basically has a universe of atoms and beyond infinite calculation of quantum particles, electrons, and subquantum particles. We don't know. It's just ridiculous to calculate that because you don't really need to look that far. Energy and vagueness brought confusion to scientists and businessmen. For the last 10 years, there's been a lot of business discussion about the value this would have if it was marketable and there was something tangible to develop and compare to help it be marketable. And we've been looking for a long time for something a little bit more solid. And most of you are aware of the book Double Helix Water and Shu Yin Lo. And there's kind of a new twist and a new understanding on this, no pun intended. And what you're looking at on the left is an AFM scan of a double strand of a solid water particle at room temperature. And there's a little bit more information about that that's been condensed and a lot simpler. To clarify, I don't think these guys are much aware of the diversity that this discovery stretches to, because what I'm here to say and postulate is that likely all natural water always had solid material in it, always had gel water in it, and always had a more organized energetic structure, which we all knew that portion. But it just occurred to me that every mountain stream is probably full of a life progression of solid particles that not only does the energy that's in the water emulate cellular formation and bacterial formation and virus formation and everything that nature needs to work properly, uh, but it also is birthing the solid matter out of itself. So the foundation of this just went through the roof on a very correlative and higher level when it comes to natural water, structured water, our understanding how the environment works, and the statements we've made that you know our device basically just enhances what water already does. It doesn't really do anything different. Water did all this before. And that turns out to be the case to a much, much greater degree. It so highly correlatively appears. And in 2018, I met a university professor at a meeting, and the topic of structured water came up from another colleague on an introduction, and he kind of just said, "Yeah, we studied that in the '70s. Big university, big, highly funded university, one of the biggest ones in the country, uh, medical and health side too." And he just simply said, "Well, I wondered what happened to that. We couldn't explain it. We knew it was working. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. We really couldn't find a mechanism for it, and so all the funding got dropped, and we never came back to it. And one of the guys went off to his garage and started making units, but he never really, got anywhere with it." Um, I just kind of laughed, 40, 50 years later, and wow, like, big universities knew about this, spent millions of dollars studying it, and because nothing tangible could come out of it, and it was all this energetic, and meanwhile, you got Andreas Schultz with a very tangible level coming up in the background, and then just of recent, since 2011, and ironically, uh, just before that, 10, 15 years, somebody actually discovered these water particles, but didn't think that they would be water. They thought they were contamination or a protein, which is easily understandable, or some other foreign object, and they couldn't see very well. There wasn't very good resolution. It was probably on a electron scan, not atomic force microscope, which is a much softer, a little bit different situation. It's not as capable as electron uh, microscopy, but it's more capable than optical by a reasonable degree. You're talking 6,000 power here, very clear down at the nano level. And as a company, we just had no idea, and I haven't heard any other company mention it yet. And we've been kicking around the idea, myself in particular, with Dr. Theo Almeida Murphy and Dr. Derek Gerlach. And Derek's been big on this one for a long time, and I've been reticent to pick up on it because um, the company didn't have enough direct experience with any type of measurement, which has changed since then. So I would expect to see publications starting more and more to come out on this and start to correlate these natural phases of water that are really allotropes. I don't want to mince the language because solids, liquids, and vapors have existed in water form the entire time. So when people start talking about new phases, it runs into trouble because it bumps into plasma, which is often referred to as a phase. But really, plasma, if you look it up, means we don't know what it is because you really can't stick anything in there without screwing up the situation and altering it, which is the truth of all things, unless they're pretty solid. And in this case, we're going to that level. I've pretty much covered these points. So a little notation about water that's subject to false logic, meaning what's good for water, entropy, aggression. We can now get down into that from an objective level and start to discern some of the things people have been passing around and saying. Um, and I'm not against what works for individuals, but on a measurable level, there's a lot of things where you need to know how to do it, not oversimplify it. Otherwise, you're making the product and its performance go backwards, and you're making the water go backwards. And it's pretty simple if you think about it. Anything vigorous or aggressive is not really all that good for the water, but you have to take that within context because a waterfall can be pretty aggressive, and that's connected to other scenarios where the two actually work together for amplification. So we can talk about that short sightedness, and we'll get into more of that in the future when we get a better understanding of how water's responding from an objective means, which we can do now. At any rate, this gives us a good opportunity to really run with structured water as a whole and geological projects with our company, just on a bigger picture altogether. It doesn't so much have to be brand and business and making money and selling focused. This is really cool science that goes beyond that, but it does have a practicality. Natural structures organizing in magnetic fields. These are steel pins that are poked through corks, standard corks, and floated in water, and then you hover a magnetic field and just move it really gently over the top, and these things dance into position like an orchestra. This experiment was conducted in 1878 and set the foundation that led to the discovery of electrons and early orbital models, and so on and so forth, and then eventually chemical compound structure. And that's where they get, the shapes they draw is there's these assumptions that nobody talks about, but it's really based on symmetry, group theory, and observed reactions from, well over 100 and some odd years ago. J.J. Thomson, however, interesting to note, um, discovered the electron, but he never admitted it was a particle. He actually favored that it was a wave. And we've talked about this, that all matter is comprised of relative frequency standing waves. A standing wave is essentially physical matter. Um, Whatever it's comprised of really doesn't matter. Um, the double vortex, we can't stress this enough, how important these phase conjugates are. Double vortex could be considered almost like a complementary color, where you have a color of one substance, you shine a light into it, and it reflects a predictable color back out of it, um, or absorbs, depending on how you want to look at the equation. Certain geometries do this, and so on and so forth. And this justifies the flow form, how they're designed, how they perform to some major degree, and the fact that off of every sphere, every rock, and every river, especially ones that sit, in the main line of center flow, off the back of them is a tightly wound vortex, and on the surface of the sides, you can see on the left, one turns top view looking downstream, one turns clockwise on the left side of the rock, and the other one counterclockwise on the right side of the rock. Then they meet on the backside, form a single vortex, and this is in a perpendicular to the situation that uh, you're talking about as water's flowing down a river or across flow forms, which are simulating, this natural condition. What's going on in that is quite impressive. And on the micro side, we always want to check to see if it's on the macro, and we've covered this too. Subtle vortexes begin with three small vortexes that orbit a false center, or an unidentified center, and disappear shortly before they reappear as one. And there may be something going on underneath the water that's toroidal. There's some experiments that support that, but uh, I've never studied that fully in my observation of that phenomena happening. But you can watch it on the sun. And here we have another flow form that's a giant coherent electrical charge. This was reported as a spaceship on the internet when it first came out, but that's highly unlikely. This dark object is an object that was sitting next to the sun, the size of Jupiter. And unfortunately, I don't have the video, but you can still look this up on YouTube. It forms a double vortex and charges up, and then this energy ball stays coherent and rapidly takes off from the sun, which means, the sun, being a centering body, has a large electrostatic charge or gravity force, one and the same. Uh, 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 an implosive condition of electric charge, or the double spiral in the center of a toroid. That's the electric science now knows this. We have pictures of it. It's become very tangible. The gyroscopic effect is amplified in the center of a magnet and broke along the outside of a magnet when a magnet is sufficiently big enough to encompass the size of a gyroscope. They run forever in the middle of a magnet. Talking a magnet, a natural magnet that's a foot in diameter. The gyroscope will run for a long, long time if you set it in the center of that magnet and stabilize it there. As soon as you move it out to the edge of the magnet, which is where the centrifugal forces are, the separating forces, the outward pressure, where things are expanding, the gyroscope comes to a stop in a matter of seconds. So all this is, you know, stuff we played with when we were children and were interested in it. And here's another example of a collapsing electrical charge. And the reason why I'm going over this again is because understanding what collapsing charges do, especially dipolar charges, which is usually the case when you're talking about a collapse, because it requires pulling two things apart to allow that energy to charge up and go beyond what is in the system. So in other words, simply moving things apart increases the energy of the system, but it's isotropic, isometric, not measurable, because it's all wound up in coherent spin. And during collapse, that spin is released in an organized fashion still. And sometimes, under the right conditions, you can see this in electrical discharges. Not often. Most of the time, it looks like lightning, but if you know what you're doing with electricity, this is fundamentally how efficient electricity works. So when we get into the future and we're not using heat cycles and destructive energies to build energy anymore, because we're actually destroying energy in the long run, um, more or less, this is going to be the indicator that you don't see this double spiral again or coherent pattern. What you don't see around this discharge is there's a field that's draining backwards, kind of like the cavitation bubbles we've looked at in the past, or toroidal with a tail, or just like that sunshot we used. And there's a couple of different scenarios that happen during that energy flow, but it's rather unimportant. We went over this, the essentials for new discovery or any frontier. And yes, I am saying structured water is the frontier. To tie all this together, this electricity and magnetism, all the way down to solid matter, back to water, and this double vortex thing, I think maybe because of the oversimplification of the technology and the way it's been discussed, which is necessary in explanations like marketing ones, like how this works. Um, the exact vortex mechanics throughout the device are not known on an empirical, subtle level, but we do know around the flow forms, as you separate the water, it begins to charge. The materials do matter. That shows up on objective testing. Not to a massive degree all the time, but it's consistent depending on what the materials are. And coming around the backside of the flow form or the rock in any river. And then the environment starts to change to that. What they don't show in the upper left picture here, which is an egg-shaped rock in the center of a river from the side view, like we were snorkeling and looking in, is that's pulling down the surface of the water. But what also happens is it builds up, it digs out, and then builds up as it moves away to where it makes this venturi that is more or less like a half natural pinch of a venturi, just kind of like a double braid makes a shape. The two spheres put together make that shape, and that accelerates flow in that region, and stops it right behind the rock. So behind the rock, it's accelerated, and those two streams eventually, I'm sorry, behind the rock, the water is still. So if you're a kayaker, you just pull in right behind the rock and you can park there with no energy. You just sit still. The water is actually moving backwards there because there's a double vortex. And then on each side of that are two accelerated streams that will flip you upside down, if you turn into them wrong coming back out of that thing. They refer to it as, cutting the seams or ferrying across a pull out, a turnout. At any rate, little practical stuff there, that these mechanics are everywhere. And then a look at, new work by, you got Ken Shoulders on the left. I should credit these people because this work all correlates to a very beautiful and simple understanding of how the universe works to a much larger degree than we've been given in the past. And then Ken Wheeler on the right with the ferrocell, showing the magnetic field. That's an end view. From the side view, you get a totally different circumstance of the same toroidal field. And sacred geometry, the flower of life, build-ups of the flower of life, assemblies of circles, right? The whole thing, the Freemasonry, showing everybody that. And now we'll get into the objective side that we're going to correlate, use this scientific, repeatable, highly precise and accurate, if operated correctly, equipment, and take a look at water specifically, and then take a look at how convention has been using this equipment, and nobody really we kind of overlooked the obvious with a lot of stuff here. And with the work of Dr. Pollock, it kind of spurred people to take another look. And Pollock, not saying too much in detail, probably unless you really dig into his papers with his colleagues, mentioning 270 nanometers. So I was very curious about that derivation, especially being that he was pulling the sample, he was seeing the 270 nanometers, I believe, in off a boundary layer of still water next to Nafion. And so the water sitting still was making a structure change within 200 or 300 micrometers. And he described it as, this is the exclusion zone because this is the clean water. The other water is dirty or junk or has the contaminants. I wholly disagree with that perspective, because water has two parts. And through the work of Benny Johansen, we can kind of see what happens when all water polarizes and structured water polarizes to a greater degree. And that puts the heat or the entropy in the center. But when water becomes structured, it unsaturates that heat. And all this work is available on naturalactiondealer.com, and we've covered it before. So there's a very special thing. Good afternoon, Nebraska and New Zealand. All right. Good to have you guys. And here we're looking at wavelength versus absorption. Wavelength on the x-axis and absorption on the y. And it's just kind of a reference to the behavior of water. These are hard to find because normally in spectroscopy, people use water as a solvent and put stuff in it. They zero out the water and then look for the change of the stuff they put in it. The chemical industry, the health and beauty, makeup, water treatment to find contaminants. Everybody's been using it to find things in the water, but nobody's paid a hell of a lot of attention to the water itself. And that's kind of where I got the idea when Pollock first started reporting is, hey, let's just start looking at distilled water and structuring and start watching what's happening. Well, if you see something happen, then it brings more questions. And if you know the science world and it's lockstep, they're hard to move off of any perspective. And right now, there's no defined methodology for looking at water, not a lot of work on it yet, and certainly not a lot of simple work. And that's what we aim to do here, is simplify this whole story about UV spectroscopy down into something physical, tangible, measurable, and that everybody can understand without having to refer back to it a whole bunch because of the strong correlation. Just like energetically, you show people a picture of how the water changes by watching how things grow in it and making a correlation to right angles being often found in pumped water, chemicalized water, toxic industrial water, and not being associated with natural water. You can make that strong correlation to the picture and then look at the qualities of the picture to make subjective assessment, which is different for everybody. Water has different roles. Most likely you can program water to carry out specific functions. That's not a scientific fact, but it's a thing that's there. It's a thing I believe in. It's a thing that I've experienced. not from, healing myself or anything with informational water, but observing its behavior in plasma development. And so we make that distinction, correct? It's not that we don't believe in this stuff or it's not possible. It's that there's really no way to measure it, which means the markets get tattered and torn with uh, hundreds of people making stuff up and then having a bad experience with beautiful developments in science as a consumer and then spreading that something was a scam makes everybody's investment a nightmare. So you have to look at this beyond yourselves and beyond natural action technologies and look at the structured water industry as the primary family. Big trouble I've always had with the water industry and technological development personally and professionally is that fact that people don't recognize that the environment sets up the pattern that takes place, and you have to work on the total environment. And our biggest total environment is the human race itself on Earth, and our next biggest family is the alternative structured water industry or alternative water health industry or water modification industry, all named a little bit different, whether you're personal use or commercialization or industrial, but it has great benefits in all those. In order to really follow through with what we're trying to do, you definitely got to get into this a little bit more. But no worries, we'll make the UV spec pretty simple once you see what's going on. Uh, Normally, it's used to identify specific compounds, like I said, and that can get very, very complex. Systems theory, group theory. You need to be very familiar with all that. I'm a big fan of systems theory. It's my preferred science for unified modeling by far. Paul Laviolette's also the greatest unified field predictor to date, objectively. And water absorbs strongly at 195 nanometers, which is in the UVC range, and it's a pretty strong UVC, being a smaller wavelength, 280 down to 190. It's at the bottom end of it. UVC will make you go blind. Welders know this. If you look at it too long, too many times, make you go temporarily blind, permanent loss of eyesight, permanent radiation damage to the skin. It's nasty stuff. So it's pretty fitting that nature would have water and nitrogen and oxygen, air and water, as very strong absorbers down below this. I can't comment on anything much below this because UV spec non-visible ends at about 190 nanometers because too many things start absorbing smaller wavelength because you're getting closer and closer to the size of compounds and atoms, and so basically the light just runs into everything, and then it becomes noise, and you can't read anything out of that. And so that is the danger with coming out and making claims about things happening at the natural peak or around the natural peak. It's actually a bit lower than 195, and we can read pretty good to 195 and okay at 190, and here's why. Um, how's the pointer working? I always have to check this thing. Yep, got it on. Here's why, because over here, which is right where, so it's a log scale, and here you're at 100 nanometers, here you're at 200, and just below that, you're at 190. So once the curves start going straight up and down, you're in a little trouble. Don't count on the accuracy of this thing because in the real world, water shifts around depending on the moon and the weather and planetary stuff, and when and how we don't fully know, because it's not like every moon phase it's doing a pattern always to specifically what we say, but it always is shifting around energetically, and whether that starts to reach physical stuff that changes, that's too deep right now, but we can go into that objectively. At any rate, what we're doing is taking our sample water, and whatever this line is, we flatten it out to zero, and then we compare it to whatever we do to the water, which in this case is however we're going to modify the water passively or with substance. I stay completely off the substance topic in the laboratory. It's strictly pure water. as pure as we can get. Distilled water doesn't behave any different than reagent grade deionized. But if we're going to report on a test, that's what we use because it's a laboratory standard. We're doing this for product development and sharing it privately. Again, not so much for publication. That's a totally different writing style. So you guys more or less get the inside track and kind of get my skinny on it, the little rougher side of it and definitely premature side of it. That's all okay. That's life. And I'll be the first to admit I put my foot in the mouth and said the wrong things. And uh, if anything's ever clarified in the rebuttals to this stuff as it starts to come out, I'll be glad to know. But this is my best take on what we're seeing personally from being present during testing and my colleagues that I work with off the record, where we build our theories and postulates and stories and then models and then develop it into practice because that's the whole purpose. We intend to put it to use for the benefit of mankind for real, not just say so. And these are part of the instruments that help do that. So we highly appreciate them and we highly appreciate the physical world and the energetic world. So now you got to watch out for all these other things: contaminants, dirty glass. You got to know what you're doing. You can't just, these machines work really simple, and I could teach any one of you how to get a reading out of one within 30 seconds. That doesn't mean you know how to operate the software, prepare the machine, calibrate it, hold your controls, and be scientific enough to cooperate with other scientists so everybody can move forward together. But it is very, very simple. We'll go over that. The contamination issue would be a trigger if you saw massive increases. The first suspect of any scientist would be there's stuff getting into the sample, and that's why you're seeing the changes. That's how big some of them are. And the changes are acting as if there was a solid in the water. Now, here's how the very basic single beam monochronometer or monochromator, as they say here, light source, a slit that plays a role. And what happens is you pick your bandwidth, and we could correlate this to color, just like they show this in the example. Even though we're actually looking to the left of the purple is where we're looking. So this prism would rotate clockwise and we wouldn't see any more light. And so we're shooting dark light as perceived by the human eye into a sample that's made out of quartz, which is a necessity for UVC analysis. Glass has way too much absorption and it can't be used. You can't see anything because all the light's gone and the machine doesn't have enough power to overcome it. And it's not a matter of power at that point. It's a matter of property and scatter and diffraction and the light just absorbing. Whether it comes to heat or not, I don't know. I'm not thorough on a technical level with these machines from a service standpoint or manufacture. A little bit on design because there's very similar principles going on here. And then a detector, which can either be a photo multiplier tube, a vacuum tube, or a diode array. Each have their advantage, but the photo detector tubes and the single beams have been around forever, and they're scientific standards because they are so simple. The other machines have so much software conversion and whatnot. So all the tests you're about to see were run on, scientific standardized machines that have been around for many, many years, that are very reliable and very simple to operate if you have some very basic training. In other words, anybody can do this. You don't need to be a scientist to identify substances in water to a large degree and understand interferometry and wave analysis and derivatives and endless amounts of things that go into the art of being a good scientific spectral chemist. Is a whole entirely different ball game. Much due respect to them because it's an amazing thing, but sometimes they overlook the simple and they assume everything should be done a certain way because that's what they're used to doing. This is a graph of, outer planetary radiation and what happens to it as it approaches the wavelength. And here is, showing that, as we get to the harmful radiation, water becomes highly absorptive, and it also has these nodes, almost like there's musical notes. You see the same things in water plasma startups and vibrational analysis on Fourier transfers, or spectral analysis. It's just a different frequency range of the same thing, looking at voltage as light and looking at electrons as displacement current. A little bit more almost particle physics there with the displacement current, and certainly light with voltage and how it's formulating and traveling through the system. So water's job is to support life. UVC needs to be blocked out, the vast majority of it. Otherwise, nothing would survive here. UVB trimmed out, and UVA to a lesser degree, and UVB and UVA are part of biological processes to a larger degree, where UVC becomes sterilizing. They actually use it to sterilize things. Why is ice blue sometimes and lakes in the sky? Well, you're starting to see this. Why it's blue is at the blue end is where it's starting to absorb oxygen, nitrogen, oxygen in the water, perhaps, and maybe to a greater degree in an assembled form. All water and air has this property. So let's just take a look at how distilled water behaves in relation to the pathway of UVC, radiation, air, quartz, and then water, then structured. Because ultimately, that is the simple side of what we're doing here, is we're watching how radiation behaves from a source after it goes through specific frequencies, and we're looking at the UVC range. So again, just a little narrow band to the left of that purple, how it interacts with this whole air pathway, how it interacts with the cuvette or the sample container, and the substance that's put in it, and the photo detector on the other side. It's pretty simple. Shine a flashlight, there's a shadow, there's a few other things going on in there, but that's the simplest version, is simply these so-called photons that travel don't make it to the detector when things are absorbed, and this is known as the percentage transmittance. So for the layman, the easy way to understand this is to understand how much percentage came through with the light. So we want to make sure we understand that anybody talking about this, and especially if you're, on the more technical level with a business, another business that's interested in product, interest in the science of it, whatever, how it goes, that you have a little background on how simple this is, what we're talking about, and the changes that are happening, and also an understanding it can become very complex. And yes, you're aware that there is natural absorption by water to a high degree at the levels we're talking about, because we are not going to talk about 270 nanometers, because we don't see anything super significant at 270 nanometers by itself. We do see things at 270 nanometers, but we see things in a lot of places. And that's why I'm saying it's time to get a broader perspective and tie the work of Pollock and Gahn and Lowe and other people's work, Johansson and Gerlach, and tie it together to a much, much simpler story that's objectively marketable. So this method of analytic is much simpler than the complex art of spectroscopy in order for that to become a systematic, scientific way of developing and sharing. Great care must be taken with these instruments, though, because a fingerprint can give you false readings. And these instruments are affordable enough where many people can start to attain them. And people who don't know much what they're doing can come up with some real weird stuff. So we're looking for cooperation at this point in the game. And we have enough degree of that where we can say nobody's doing anything super screwy here that's off, because we're getting the same results, and go from there. And I'm just looking to simplify it for everybody, where scientists tend to just put out the data and go, here you go. And you're supposed to understand what it all means. To establish somewhat accurate and quantitative measurements within the realm we are seeing change, and also not disturb the quality, general shape, changes. So quantities are measurable things, and qualities are a little bit more subjective. Like this has a quality of X is a broader thing, where quantitative stuff is how much magnitude of absorption do you have specifically between 195 and 220 nanometers wavelength in the UVC range. And then we compare data across the world. It takes a lot more to be quantitative than it does to be qualitative. And right now we're just in the qualitative mode because it's easy, it's simple. So our target is to explore to see if structured water does a better job at blocking harmful radiation, in particular the UVC range, and use all the basic controls and tests to do that, and show that we've taken the steps to do that. So, like I said, you guys will always be able to revisit this in the future and get this off of naturalactiondealer.com. So, no worries. And if anybody has any questions, pop them, because we're going to kind of get into the meat of what's different about what's been put out before and how it relates to our device and all probably well functioning structured water devices to some degree together. We're not sure about the devices that don't flow. We're busy testing flow devices because we know flow itself is an element in this process. But there's a story to it, and that story is going to unfold over some time to get into those details. For now, I'm just coming into the first level of this and see where we get with an understanding, and build these up as we go on with research and study. We've mostly talked about all this stuff, and you guys have seen before. It's very important. People used to get upset that nothing changed in the water, because that disproved that the device worked or not. And then we would get into this energetic discussion, and there was no way to show anything there. And the Hagalis method is poorly understood. So that's another one that, you know, needs to propagate and corroborate to tie these both together, because the two make beautiful complements to each other, and eventually make the instruments that measure structured water someday, where, you know, you push buttons and software interpolates stuff and you get a reading. And that is a real world customer perspective. And the programming of water will be able to be done by anybody informationally. And it's highly likely that well-structured water will receive that program better, hold that program better, and execute that program better. That is the purpose of the technology, not so much to put information into the water. Little bit of subtlety with the information doesn't hurt, but cramming too much information in there and making it too rigid is an issue with water on the informational side. From my perspective, from all my research, then again, we don't have anything to measure that. I would have to make some long stories and share a lot of data to make that argument about information. And it wouldn't be the same type of information as what other people are talking about from their understanding. Uh, Not really relevant, because we're dealing with this solid root energetic now. So the open air pathway is the first thing we measured, and I think you guys will understand this very well. We're looking at the transmittance of the light through that pathway. And so what we do is we calibrate the machine and we put nothing in it, and then we take a zero reading, and then we take a measurement of that zero reading to show that the machine can hold stable at 100% at the intensities of light that are present, because you have limits. Understand that. And so here's the zero line, and you see a little deviance. The deviance here is on the average is about 0.05% in the data sheets. And you can see it's right at the 100% level. So when we look at the data pull off of this, it's 100.01, 100.03, you know, for hundreds of data points every 2 nanometers from about 340 down to 190, you can see on the bottom, which is your wavelength, and the transmittance. And so the idea is these specific wavelengths, the machine will shoot 330 against something, then 328, then, and it's going to check how much light makes it across that pathway according to a reference. As stated, this graph is referenced to 0. Now, this is when we put the cuvette in the pathway. If we refer back to the um, situation there, that's with the cuvette in the situation as the 0 was without it, shooting across this distance. And you see the quartz cuvette has a level of absorption, which is, let me get back to it here. That, and before every test in the lab, there's multiple core cuvettes you have. They drop, they break easy. Some of them get stained permanently. If you clean them with acid, they can get scratched. So we only zero out to the open pathway to double check the cuvettes before we start running test batteries. And there's methodology also to double check things. I just want to make sure we're all clear about this going forward, because a lot of scientists make assumptions that they all know what each other's doing, and a lot of technicians, and this very much clarifies to the layman and the scientist that the whole pathway is understood, the cuvette is understood. We have plenty of juice left in the machine to run these tests. Now we put the distilled water control in it, which is the red line, and we see it drop to 48. So the vast majority of UVC blocking is done by regular water itself, and uh, gives us a profile that's characteristic of that water. Now we structure the water and we begin to see changes. So this is just a standard, simple old pour, and the control at the end of the test was shaken vigorously, which is the red, to see if that structured water. Well, movement is part of it. The quality of movement is very important to get the effect, the repeatable effect. We're shining a light through a bunch of stuff and it hits a light receiver, and we're looking to see how much light makes it there. And from hundreds and hundreds of tests, we can say without a shadow of a doubt that structured water over pouring, over shaking, over improves its radiation absorption performance over distilled water in a very measurable degree, from, you know, in the entire UVC band from 280 on down. So we see increases everywhere, very, very consistent and repeatable. You could run these lines on top of each other, back to back to back. Consequently, this is very, very stable. And this is what shocked me, is the bandwidth of stability that goes on with this. So stable, because when I used to send samples out to the laboratory, they'd run a single test and it's very expensive, and you don't get to see much. You don't get to dictate the test controls. So here's a little bit more dramatic, and this is 6 pours. There's ways to get these effects without having to pour it through 6 times. We'll get to that in the future. But this is standard and typical. These are different devices, different styles, subtle changes that make big differences in the absorption. And now you see we went from 72% off the cuvette in the air down to about 54, your top line, the orange, and all the way down to the other orange line on the bottom, or red line on the bottom, which is down at about 35. So now you're starting to see about a 20% performance increase in absorption. And you can typically, what we see is if you wait about 30 minutes, the structuring actually always gets a tad better, which surprised me. In the presence of Wi-Fi, in the presence of LED lighting, in the presence of music, heavy metal or classical, this is all very, very consistent. And I got the feeling that this is almost behaving like it's freaking solid. You know, there's no way we have this much contaminants in here, because we've done so much other testing, trying to find conductivity changes and pH changes, which don't really change at all. that we knew the devices were very stable. These are devices from ones from about 6 years ago. No difference in performance versus a device that's, fresh off the press, more or less. This is a typical, and this is after it was left sit for a while. And you'll see these curves shift a little bit and get these second humps before storms, large thunderstorms. You'll get shifts like this, but the basis of the curve is always the same, the quality of it, and the peak tends to move up. It changes with location, altitude, so you're going to get some subtleties. But here you see kind of a little double peak, at uh, about 197 and a 195. 195 is the peak on this. A couple of simple scans, and that little jerk you see over at 340 nanometers is because this is wider scan. On the bottom is the baseline of distilled water. Shook. I've stirred them with spoons for a half an hour. Spoons made out of natural plastic, spoons made out of metal. Stirred to the left, stirred to the right. Shook the water, and consequently, all the tests get run through an identical canister device with no flow form in it as a control. So we're taking great measures here to isolate everything to the effect of the flow form and the materials. And you see that second smaller peak form, and that's kind of moving up towards where Gerald Pollack's talking about. But the important thing here is to look at the change across the board. Forget about any spikes. Forget about 197 for right now. It's important, but why is it changing everywhere else? So it begs the question, what the heck is in the water that's making for all this massive increased absorption after the water is structured? And here's Archer Labs, outside laboratory. Very similar results. You guys have seen these before. I didn't do much explaining other than saying, it's absorbing more. We didn't really talk about UV radiation, just left it pretty general. So you see some cooperation over time, even very similar characteristic. You see this second curve coming on here. So now we get down into a totally different circumstance with water. And a contrary thing going on in one hand, but a totally supportive thing going on in another. I'm going to answer the question. I just picked it up. I'll address this UV spec because it's a good place to leap into where we're headed with this next. And we'll stop for the question, though. So this is an ORAC, or a charging chamber. Experiments done by Wilhelm Reich about increasing biofield energy. People think that maybe this is related to bions, and what he was talking about there's not a very strong correlation. But look again, down in the UVC, we're talking nothing at first. After days in the charging machine, 41 days, you're up at the blue. But that second hump is gone that you see after the orange, which is 1 day of charging. You see similar values. But nonetheless, the concept and principle is exactly the same. And you see some drifting going on way up there, 600, 800 nanometers through the UV visible range, and then towards the far end of the infrared. Can't say much about it, but we see that, and we see reason for it. We see reason for all of this, and we'll go into that next. So I'm going to question by Marina: should I give this tech info out all the time? I don't know. I mean, that's for you to decide. That's discerning who you're talking to. This is so you understand what you're talking about with new findings of structured water that most likely are not going to be rejected by science because it's irrefutable. That's what we're about to get to. I would tend to start with the simplest and then work my way backwards. I always go simple. That's what I'm leading to is there's pictures that are backed up by science. I would use the pictures. The pictures already exist. We already know the technology works. It's going to be corroborated with people, the likes of Manchester University, if people get involved and continue to help out. A little disappointing in the fundraiser because, we basically only got money for giving product away cheaper than what people could buy it for. So it's sad to see nobody was really willing to give for the most part on a pure giving level. And now we're in that stage where, the company can't afford to subvert its own sales for any longer to make this happen. And hence the conflict of interest with being part of a fundraiser is we can't put ourselves out of business trying to be more credible and more professional. That's all this is. You use it to the degree you want. It's very simple to understand. So from there, you kind of pick through it, like we've always said, till we're brand unified and more franchise like. We really can't dictate how things are done. So we don't know what people are doing out there. We'd rather have people talking about solid science and sharing personal experience than constantly making stuff up, which every industry gets. It's nothing specifically directed towards us, but we had our fair share of it. Uh, the next question from Judith: do we have data that specifically shows effect on fluorine and chlorine in the existing tap water that has passed through a portable unit or a whole house unit? The answer to that question is no. We do not address chlorine and fluorine from a physical standpoint with structuring. Uh, we don't have any direct correlation that those are physically dealt with and bound from a biological perspective in the body. That would take human studies. We're just getting to the point where a credible university is willing to do a human study. It would take that to make that correlation. Electrical charge scenario, it's highly likely that water has the capacity and the body has the capacity where chlorine and fluoride are non factors. For an unhealthy body, chlorine and fluoride could be agitating, or a sensitive person, something of that nature. For most people, under healthy practices, the body is going to take care of that and not deposit it. That's the truth of a healthy body versus an unhealthy body. And you have to decide what that is for yourself. Uh, we are going to be coming out with a product most likely that is a mineral colloid that you put in water that wipes out the chlorine and the fluoride and a heck of a lot of other stuff. I'm not certain on that. That's not formal at this point. It's just what I want to see happen as a company. It's amazing colloid you add to water that not only delivers you minerals that are essential for the body, but has a colloidal process that actually causes not only chlorine and fluorine, but glyphosate, nicotine, and hundreds of other synthetic petroleum chemicals and pharmaceuticals to drop out of the water and precipitate. And then any filter will grab it, or you just don't drink the bottom of the water. And if you do, it's not harmful because it's completely neutralized and it has all the lab work has been done. So that is our solution for people who feel like the physical needs to come out of the water. I personally I've seen some pretty amazing things happen with structured water. Alone is the only change in a regimen, but it had its limits because, let's talk animals. The diet was the same. So there was a stark improvement in the animals' condition, but the diet was still the same, and more or less found out the food we were feeding them was, poisonous for a liver that's been weakened, which any blood that starts to saturate is from, poor digestive process, and liver is really where this most sickness starts, is going to be well understood and is pretty easily measured. The microbiome, the health of all that, which structured water kind of helps with that to a large degree, but there's a lot of crossover microbiome and yeast that behave on both sides of the fence. And they're nasty at times when they flare up and then they calm down and chill out. And but when you add this mineral colloid to the structured water, me personally, um, with my condition I deal with, which isn't hardly a condition anymore at all. And the biggest leap I found out of 20 different therapies besides structured water and adding these other things has been that. And I felt the need to bring that to market, uh, fine tune that and bring it to market. And that's the best way to filter anything out and go forward, accomplish both, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah, I'm eager to see it too. I mean, there's a lot involved in all that, so we're working on it, and we're working on getting everything in order for the hemp to figure out how that's going to fit in to the equation to go to natural plastics. So I think we're on a really good pathway, and we're right in that difficult, transition. Having to make the transition to big corporatism and fit in that world in order to survive. And I look forward to the challenge. I hope I'm doing a good job with it. I'm doing the best I can. I really enjoy it at any rate. So that's about all you can do in life. So here we go. The solid stuff, I've talked about this before. We originally thought, because the discoverers originally thought, or at least the guys who identified what they were seeing first, uh, thought it was kind of more like ice, like chips or shards or these frozen things that they didn't quite know what happened with them or whatnot. And we certainly didn't have any suspect that they were coming out of any other thing except a really strong implosion. And basically, they're diluting the water until the charges get so far apart that some of them collapse, some of them just charge up, and the water is getting in between them as you dilute it. That's what's happening under an even spread. Water actually isn't evenly spread throughout, as we can see through Benny Johansen and so these things shift a little bit because water is polarized. It's different on the outside next to its boundary than it is on the inside, but nonetheless, there is an averaging of that, especially with regular bulk water. The spread isn't all that much. It's pretty. There's not much polarization, and that's part of the death of water. Is you're taking the internal polarization out of it. It'd be like trying to say male and female are exactly the same and not allowing for the strengths and weaknesses of male and female. We become neutered more or less in our natural qualities. At sufficient distance by solution, the atomic field charge collapses and you get these different shapes. There appears to be a trend of unified spin associated with electrical field collapse, a vortex, in other words, sometimes a double vortex. And so, what shapes you get out of this are all entirely different. And then you have a paper that just came out that kind of jumps right to the bone, makes it simple, goes right to the measurements, doesn't talk about methodology too much, but I feel that whole methodology is important to understand. Um, Science, and I heard some announcements in the news that there's a gel phase of water. This is, again, phase means liquid, solid, gas, and you'd have to be discernibly different. So I don't like, I'm a linguist. I don't, in science especially, I don't like to muddle language. When you get a matrix of a solid and a liquid and you mix it together, it's a mixture of a solid and a liquid. It is not another phase of something. Just because the properties change subtly does not mean it's another phase of something. If the properties change massively, the phase is the same, but it's an allotrope. So we got these soft solid particles we now understand. And this is very important in the understanding because now questions where during testing we would go, man, it's behaving like a solid. But when we try and get confirmation of it or try, if there were solids, then the pump wouldn't destroy it. So we don't have any of that in our device, and neither do you, neither do you, neither do you, and neither do rivers, right? That all just changed in my eyes, especially after getting to spend, 100 hours or so around the direct spectroscopy testing and getting to play with certain things that might, test this, might not. And getting more closely with some colleagues and going, what do you think we're really looking at here? For those of you who missed the interview with Theo, be up, I believe we kind of touched on it a little bit in there, but not too deep. And he talks about the process here. It's repeated dilution like homeopathy, except this is a very expensive machine that doesn't allow interference by air. It's way beyond homeopathy. I believe 1,000,000 times dilution is required before supposedly this effect starts to really take place. And realize these guys are looking at this in a big concentrate, it's a big way, and then they're concentrating it under a droplet under an AFM microscope. So the concentrate of this stuff is a lot more because it's extracted into a drop and evaporated, and right when there's a drop left, they're looking at it. Kind of almost like the crystal analysis, except there is nothing present here except water. That's it. So these solid structures are water. I covered that. And this is what we kind of know more now that's really cool. These on the bottom right, I'm pointing at it with my finger on the screen here. The bottom right here are little circles, and this is where the process starts. These are obviously denser than you would normally see even out of what they had because the water is beginning to evaporate so they can look at these solid particles, and there's film coatings and a complex side of this, but skip all that. And then sometimes they get together in chunk balls, a bunch of them. Sometimes they get together in toroidal donut rings that have, hexagonal and pentagonal looking shapes and irregular shapes. Less they get into single winding patterns. Less than that, they seem to get into double winding patterns. They look like bacteria under a microscope. These rods are filled with 3 wide circles. They twist and constrict and do all sorts of things. And now we're starting to look at this as, oh my God, it's not a vibrational, thing that's starting to bring in, other forms of matter to build life, which we all believe water did that. It's actually brewing the substrate of biological life right out of itself. The average size of these balls is about 100 nanometers, and they like to get together in pairs. We read a little bit more about it. If a solid contains a liquid, so these are balloons, but they're pretty tough. But they're not tough enough to go through metal bladed pumps without destruction, to be put into toxic soil and maintained. They'll do better. But just like a cell, this is what we're speculating at this point. These things can shrivel up and dry up in the wrong environment. They won't stay totally living as a solid cell outside of liquid. They'll crumble and fall apart and even dissolve as they're drying out. Go back in the water, break into tinier particles that the microscope can't see. And so most people structuring with spherical flow forms are accomplishing moving the water into more of a solid birthing state of itself. And that is how structured water fundamentally is maintaining itself and working in the body. And that aspect of it lasts a very, very long time. The energetic aspect, we don't really know how long it lasts, though we might be able to say, and with research now, measure and get some quantitative data on this stuff. Um, I could tell you for a fact that people were just making up how long it lasts because it wasn't referenced to anything. You always have to reference, where was it? Was it in a Wi-Fi house, a non-Wi-Fi house? Was it heated? Was it cooled? What was the laboratory control that was done to give a reference point to make a statement or claim? I've never seen one published by anybody. We're doing that work now, and that's what triggered me is, how is this stuff so stable? And these profiles are all so similar, yet sometimes they change, but they change in a similar way. So it's kind of not solid. So what is going on here? So I just came across this on Amazon, a week ago. Because, being in the lab, I was like, well, let's see what's going on. And it all started to make more sense to me what I was seeing going on during testing. And here you see a gel-like solid spiral that has easy water on the outside of it and inside of it, and it's starting to evaporate and decay. And you see this water trail that barely shows up on the microscope because it's breaking apart, it's leaking. And you see the measurement here with, a shade spectra. They're saying this thing's around, has a depth of about 659. Those things aren't always all that accurate. But then here you have a linear measurement, which is a much more accurate reference that comes off the microscope reference itself. And so you can see this particle is it's a pretty big particle, 2.5 microns. So you're looking at 2,500 nanometers out the range where we're looking. And here you see polarization and likelihood. The most likely condition is getting in pairs first, no different than cellular replication and so on and so forth. And this is what we've all been saying for a long time in the energetic form, what we thought was happening very confidently, but it actually is happening physically. And what it most looks like, what we would expect to see if we knew this first, and this was in the water in any significant concentration whatsoever, that every time we pour through the device, if the condition of vortexing and surface layer interaction is forming this gel water, the energy is cleaning up. Water is just opening up back to what it used to naturally form in every river and every place and all time. And it goes through its natural process of degradation when it gets exposed to too much UV sunlight in the river. Look at that natural quality of the inherent design of this. That it protect the river and the biological from the bottom up, the bacteria that the insects are there, that the trout feed, that will only live in clean rivers that you can drink out of. You look at what kind of trout live in a river to know whether you can drink out of it. That's how the forester lives. It's easy. I used to spend a lot of time in the forest, in the woods. When it's healthy around, and that can be intuitive. But this is a whole different thing. And for reference, I put a little black dot to show 100 nanometers, which we can't see. But remember the propensity to pair up. Look at the size of all these, and then look at what they can grow to. So you can have 100 nanometer particles likely, 200 likely, some 150s on their way as they're swelling, growing, shrinking, breaking. Some big clusters over here that's probably 700 nanometers. You could have particles that are 400, 300, but the highest probability in the early stages of water returning is 200 nanometers and getting together in pairs and then grouping into more complex structures that represent red blood cells, bacteria, DNA. You see what's going on here. This is a much better story to tell and then to bring in the energy aspect in real short form. Meaning, in answer to Judah's question, I would create my own story that was very, very simple based around this information that shows some simple pictures of the energetic and the physical and the latest and greatest. You need to look at the whole picture. So between Andreas Schultz and this, we have the more permanent and solid. Between Schultz, we have a quality aspect going on. Now we can answer questions like method of pouring, shaking it 100 times versus 30 times. And now you see if we have delicate stuff trying to grow, I think it's a good idea to shake the hell out of it 100 times. And you want both aspects to be of high quality, meaning you want this to grow as much as possible. You want it to grow in the ways as possible. So it doesn't take away. It's not like, oh, Wi-Fi is okay now because these are stable structures. And no, there's still a quality of information going on. And that's the next level water is going to come to. I'm pretty sure I covered all this pretty good, except for the 100 nanometer size in the liquid and coherent domains, and other scientists proposing that that's what easy water is made out of, and it all makes sense. And the water bridge, which defies gravity, that, since I used to work with heavy electricity and water, if you really look at that, it's got a double spiral. It's braiding itself just like a rope, strengthening itself, if you will. Um, and to let you all know, other water has been tested quite significantly too, and this effect occurs with bottled waters, mineral waters, tap waters to a large degree. The problem is there's noise, and you have to go figure out in great detail what is in that water. Like if we test Fiji water or Mount Shasta water, two of my favorite waters, you can't just jump to a conclusion. With reagent grade distilled water, there's nothing else in there. So, that being said, if we were working in a laboratory and they came over and said we have undeniable proof that water under collapsing fields is capable of producing its own solid self, and we are certain it's water and nothing else in a very pure form, and it's a new allotrope of a solid and liquid of water, and the light is both being absorbed by similar particle and differential particle by being scattered all over the place. Both are happening, and that's why the incident light is being, the radiation is not making there, and it's a part of design of natural nature. That's our strong correlative take on it at this point, and we got some pretty healthy scientists who are willing to go pretty deep down that road, so we'll be coming out with some papers on it in the future. Give a shout out to David Gahn and Dr. Lowe, James DeMayo, Dr. Gerlach, Dr. Pollack, Andreas Schultz, Benny Johansson. Also, my friend and colleague, Dr. Theo Almeida Murphy, because he's a big help with a lot of this and getting in touch with these people, and love is working on this and contributing. And great guy, and we'll have him on more in the future to share, because he's always learning more stuff, and go from there. Thank you very much. I thank you all for coming, giving up your early or late Friday evening, and being interested in supporting these whole efforts. It's much appreciated, and I think we're all going to do very good together going forward.